Hello, YouTube. This is Emails03. So we actually have a very busy 20 minutes ahead of us because the goal for this lesson is to basically review object-oriented programming, but then we have a completely new topic to bring up. Okay, so basically in this lesson, I wanted to tell you about something called regular expressions. And basically, it's a way of essentially matching a pattern in a string. And basically, if you were trying to authenticate someone's email address or password, you would want to make sure that it conforms to a particular pattern. So maybe you've heard of a regular expression before, but that's going to be the focus of this lesson. In lesson 33, we said that a class is a blueprint for a new data type. And so a constructor is responsible for instantiating an object. And the way that it does that is typically by assigning values to instance variables. And we said that instance variables are particular to instances of a class. And different instances of a class can have different values for the instance variables. Classes can have both class variables, which are intrinsic to the class as a whole, and instance variables, which belong to instances, right? And so we already talked about that. And then we can go ahead and, return, or we can change the values of instance variables. And we talked about functions, which are capable of doing that, right? We could go ahead and change the income instance variable. We saw multiple examples of that. A subclass is a class that inherits the functionality and fields from another class. So we talked about in lesson 34, how a subclass has the option to accept all of the superclass's functionality, but it can also either modify the superclass's functions or variables, or it can define its own new functions and variables that are specific to the subclass. So we would, if we wanted to basically use the superclass's version of f, and we wanted to basically run it with the input 3, and then we wanted to take that result and add 5 to it, then we could go ahead and write something in the subclass's version of f, like something like super, return super.f of 3 plus 5. So that would run the superclass's version of f, returning the result of the function when 3 is the input, and then adding 5 to that result. So hopefully that's clear to you. And then remember, the str method is for printing the string representation of an instance, and we get to specify what that might include. So for example, if you were talking about a person instance, we might have their name, and then is, and then age, and then years old. So that was the goal of lesson 35. In lessons 36 and 37, we talked a lot about dunders, and we said that basically these are special functions that have 2 underscores before them and 2 underscores after them, and basically they signal to Python that we can basically use arithmetic expressions or have Boolean operations between 2 instances of a class. So what does it mean to multiply 2 person objects together? What does it mean to see if one instance is less than another instance? We can specify all that behavior, and we talked about 12 ways to do that in lesson 35. And then in lesson 36, we continued, and we said that we can also basically process or treat our instance as if it's an iterable, so as though it has basically a length, and as though we could grab values from it like it were a dictionary, right? We said x of name, right? As if you could basically treat a person instance x as though it were a dictionary where you could put in a name key and get x's name out of it as a value. So hopefully that's clear to you, but that was the goal of lesson 37. And then in lesson 38, we talked about private instance variables, and we talked about the difference between weakly private instance variables, which other classes or, outside of the classes discouraged from using, and strongly private instance variables, which outside of the class you are literally not allowed to use. So hopefully that's clear to you. In lesson 39, we talked about the difference between class methods and static methods, although hopefully the takeaway you have from that video is that they basically have more in common than what's different about them, right? They can both create instances of a class. They can both change class variables, right? And they can both act on a class, okay? A couple of differences with class methods. Remember, you have a class method decorator. With static methods, you have a static method decorator on top of the function header, right? Another difference is that class methods have to have CLS as the first thing in the parentheses, right? And then you would basically be referring to the class itself, whereas static methods usually operate a little bit more independently, right? And you still call them on the class, but usually those types of methods are not so intrinsic to the class. They're basically just independent functions that the class sort of provides for use outside of the class. So that was discussed in lesson 39. And then in lesson 40, we talked about basically getter and setter methods. And we said, how do we resolve a situation where we want to return the value of a strongly private instance variable? or maybe we want to modify the value of a weekly private instance variable, but we don't want to do anything that would be anti-etiquette or anything that would, cause an issue with our Python enhancement proposals. Remember, when we tried printing a weekly private instance variable, it went ahead and underlined it with a Python enhancement proposal, and it said, oh, you should not try to, grab a protected member from outside of the class, right? So that's weekly private, that it gets upset with you, but it doesn't prevent you from doing it, right? If you had underscore in front of an instance variable, then it's a strongly private instance variable, and you are literally prohibited from calling that instance variable directly outside of the class. And we talked about ways to get around that. You could have the get item dunder, where you basically call for that, instance variable as a key, and then instruct Python to return the, that value as a result. You could have a toString method, which would make the value of an instance variable available. But we talked about another way to do it, and that's with getter and setter methods, okay? And basically, getter methods in Python are called properties. And so basically, if you have a strongly private instance variable, like age, which was our example like we talked about in the videos, you could basically go ahead and coincide the name of that instance variable with two more functions. And the functions are both going to be called age, but here's how they're going to work. One of them is going to have a property decorator on it. And basically what that means is it basically indicates to Python that we can go ahead and call the age function on an instance variable, even though this age coincides with a strongly private instance variable, right? So if you tried printing, the result, just age, the instance variable of an instance, it would say there's an issue. This is a strongly private instance variable. But this property, basically what we saw in the previous video, is that it enables you to basically go ahead and just check what a person's age is, right? So we can go ahead and see an example of that. You can see I already have some more code here for us to be looking at in this video. But what we could do, we see it in lines 177 and 178, right? You can literally go ahead and set the age instance variable, even though this was private, right? And then you can return it. So you can have these operations, and this uses the setter method, and this uses the property or the getter method. And that is basically a function whose name coincides with the name of a private instance variable. But if you have the right decorator, property, or setter method on it, then it allows you to basically have a double purpose. So now it works as a setter method. If you say x.age equals 70, it literally changes the value of the strongly private instance variable without directly referencing the strongly private instance variable. So this is a getter method. It returns the value of the strongly private instance variable. And this is a setter method. It changes the value of the strongly private instance variable. There's a couple other things we can say real quick. So making something private isn't restricted to just variables. Functions can also be private. And so what you can do is you can have a private function, and you can see two underscores here. And basically what that function would do is you can only call from this from person. Okay, so that's what it would print to the console. But then if you had a public function, okay, what you could do is you could say about to call the contents of the private function, and then you could basically call the private function. And since the private function is being called from the same class in which it was defined, it's okay, right? So we can call a private function only from the same class in which it is defined, right? And that's what we're doing here. Private function and public function are obviously in the same class, okay? But we would have an issue if we went ahead and ran c.private function, okay? So I'm going to show that to you. And it had two underscores. So this is an example of a private function or a strongly private function. And you can see that we're going to have an exception. It's going to throw an attribute error, and it's going to say you can't do that. So then what we would have to do is we would have to call in the public function, which in turn calls the private function, okay? Because the public function is in the same class as the private function. So then it's okay. And then basically it would say about to call the contents of the private function. Remember, that's what the public function prints. And then it calls the public function and the private function, and the private function prints this. So anyway, hopefully that's clear to you. That's an example of a private function. What I wanted to talk about in this video is regular expressions. Okay, so regular expressions verify that strings match a pattern, like an email address. We can also use them to perform substitutions in a string. What we need to do in order to talk about regular expressions and see how versatile and useful they can be is to go ahead and go to blackle.com. And there have been several times in this curriculum where we've need to go to blackle.com to usually look up modules and to understand how modules work. And we want to understand another module in this video called re. It's literally the letters re. Okay, and you could go ahead and be a little bit more specific. So say re Python module. Okay, and you should see one link here. It's from docs.python.org. But then if you go ahead and click it, you'll see all this documentation about what regular expressions are. And basically what they're used for is for matching expressions. So you want to make sure that an email address has an @ symbol in it and then a .com at the end, right? That could use a regular expression to make sure that, you know, someone's email address that they input is a valid syntax, right? Is a valid format. So what we're going to do is we're going to introduce regular expressions in this video. And in the next video, we're going to go into a lot more difficult examples. We're going to talk about something called meta characters. Okay, so basically we're going to spend the next 30 minutes, 10 minutes in this video and 20 in the next talking about regular expressions. But our conversation of object-oriented programming is done. And I'm pretty sure at this point there are only 3.5 lessons left. What you need to do is you need to go ahead and import RE. So you're just going to go ahead and import this module. And so if you scroll all the way up, you see that I have that on line 1. Okay, and so that's fine. So then you need to go ahead and import that and make sure that it's at the top of your executable file. What we're going to do is we're going to learn about some different operations. So basically, we're going to learn about a pattern and then a word to check for. Okay, so you have to think about a pattern basically it's a string, but it has an R in front of it. Okay, so basically whenever you declare that there's a pattern that you want to check for example, if you want to make sure that the word excellent starts with the letters EX, or you want to make sure that the word opposite starts with the letter O, right? This is examples of matching, and you can see if a particular string starts with a particular sequence of characters. That's a common example of a regular expression. Okay, so for pattern, if you're talking about a pattern, you need to have an R before the string that before the string that has the pattern that you're checking for. Okay, so it says don't forget the R before the string. So we're going to see an example of that. And then you're just going to have another string that will represent a word or a sentence or a phrase, a string, where you're checking for the pattern within it. Okay, so this is just an ordinary string that might or might not contain a pattern. And your goal is to use this regular expression theory, to use the functions from this regular expression module to go ahead and see whether or not there's a match of a particular type. Okay, and so we're going to study some different functions in this lesson. But what we're going to do is we're going to scroll down below the person class. We're pretty much done talking about the object-oriented stuff. But what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and scroll to line 181. So we have a pattern here. And basically what we have to remember is that patterns are strings that start with R before the double quotes. Okay, so remember you have to have an R here. And basically that signals to Python that that's a pattern that it's going to check for in some other string. And then we're going to have a word to check. So I'm going to have something like application, okay? And so basically this is a word application, right? And you can see that the letters CAT appear in the word application, okay, in that particular sequence, right? Like there's not a C and then an A somewhere else and then a T, but literally there's CAT somewhere in the word, but it's not at the beginning of the word. So what we're going to do is we're going to learn about two functions from the regular expression module. Basically, what I want to do is I want to scroll back up to the doc strings here. So re.match of pattern and word to check. So it accepts two arguments. It's called the match function, okay, and it belongs to the regular expression module. So re.match of pattern and word to check, okay, you're going to stick in the pattern and you're going to stick in a string or a sentence or word to check. And it's going to check to see whether the word to check begins with the pattern that you passed in, okay? So basically, if we go ahead and take a look at our example here, we can see that cat is, you know, contained in the word application, but application doesn't start with the word cat. So it turns out that this would basically represent a false Boolean. Okay, so then what we're actually going to do is, I guess we're going to run all this code at the same time, which might not be ideal, but you can go ahead and skip these two lines. We already talked about that. That's from the previous example when we called the public function. But now we're looking at the regular expressions. So for re.match of pattern and word to check, it says no match at the beginning, okay? Because re.match basically would evaluate to true, okay? It basically is equivalent to a true Boolean if the word to check starts with the pattern, okay? But re.search of a particular pattern and word to check will evaluate to a true Boolean if the word to check contains this pattern anywhere within it. Okay, so we can scroll back up. So remember, re.match is to see if the string starts with the pattern, But re.search is to just see more generally, if the word to check somewhere contains the pattern. Okay, so certainly if re.match is true, then re.search is also true. Okay, but just because re.search is true doesn't mean that re.match is true. So here it says match somewhere. Okay, that's the second thing that we printed, because app does exist somewhere within application, right? And that is at the beginning, but it would have worked the same way if you had said ion here, right? Ion is at the very end of the word. So now if you go ahead and run it, it's still going to say match somewhere. So you can see that on the console. Okay, so hopefully that's clear to you. What we're going to do now is we're going to talk about re.findall of pattern word-to-check. Okay, so it's going to accept the same two arguments, a particular pattern and then a word-to-check. Remember, the pattern is a string that starts with an R, and it represents a pattern that you're looking for within the word-to-check. It's going to return a list where every element is one occurrence of the pattern within the string. So if there were two occurrences of ion in the word ion, right? If you just had a string, I-O-N, I-O-N, if there are two occurrences of ion, which there are, then it'll return a list where one element is ion and the other element is ion, right? Because there were two ions. Okay, and so that's why we see do here, because let me show you what I'm talking about. So the string that we're looking at is how many do's do you do in this string. Did I say that right? How many do's do you do in this string? So there's 3 do's, and that's why we get a list with 3 do's in them. And you could convert that to a tuple. You could convert it to a set, but how many elements would that set have? 1, because all the matches are duplicates of one another. Okay, so hopefully that's clear to you. And then we basically, what re.search of pattern word-to-check. Okay, so we're familiar that basically re.search of pattern word-to-check will basically evaluate to true if pattern is within word-to-check, and it evaluates to false if pattern is not found within word-to-check. But basically, if you go ahead and set that equal to something, so if you set re.search of pattern word-to-check equal to something like X, and then you say X.group, or X.start, right, on this line, or X.end on this line, or X.span on this line. So it's literally calling a function on another function, right? You can see that re.search, that returns, that's an output, right? But then you can go ahead and call .group on it, or .start, or .end, or .span. So .group returns the string that was matched, but it throws a runtime error if there was no match. Okay, so let me show you what I mean by that. Since app exists within apps, so if you call group, it'll just return the match. Okay, so it'll just go ahead and return app there. So hopefully that's clear to you, because there was a match, right? But if you had said, ax here, then it would go ahead and throw a runtime error, okay? Because then there's no match, and you can see an attribute error. So hopefully that's clear to you. If you have a start here, what this start function does is it basically returns the index position of the beginning of the first occurrence of the match. Okay, so basically, since what you have to do is you have to think about if this dog exists in this dog, right? And the answer is yes. In fact, the main string dog that we're looking at starts with the pattern, right? And so what this would do is it would return 0, okay? Because dog literally starts with dog. But if you had said e-dog, then this would return 1, okay? Because so hopefully that's clear to you. It returns the index position of the beginning of the first occurrence of the match within the string, okay? And then if you have end, what the end does is it actually returns the index position immediately after the first occurrence. Okay, so let me show you what I mean by that. And let me show you what I'm talking about. So we're looking for the pattern E within the word get. Okay, and you can see that it occurs at index position 1. So if you had basically called start, then this would return 1. But if you call end, it would basically look at the very first index position after that pattern is over. Okay, so you could say, to make it less confusing, you could say jest here, right? And so basically then this would go ahead and print 3, because ES, that pattern really ends at index position 3. Like the first time you're not matching it anymore, so with the T. So then if you go ahead and run it, then you see the 0 because dog started with dog, and 3 because that's the index position of the T. And then finally and then this span returns both the results of start and end. Okay, so basically span returns a tuple, and there's 2 elements in the tuple. The first one is the index position of the beginning of the first match within the string, and the second index position within the tuple is the first index position immediately after the first match within the string. So that would be the result of start and end, and you're just going to see those 2 elements clumped up into a tuple. So that's why you see 1 and 4, right? Because stopping the T has index position 1, and then this second P here, right, where the pattern ends, has index position 4. So hopefully that was interesting to you, and we'll talk more about regular expressions in the next video and meta characters. From uMills03, thanks for watching, and please subscribe.